Good afternoon. Welcome to our weekly class on Pirkei Avot, Ethics of the Fathers. We're in chapter 1, and we're up to the 17th Mishna, the 17th paragraph. The 16th paragraph quoted a teaching by Rabbi Gamliel. And now it's Rabbi Gamliel's son. Shimon, his son, Rabbi Gamliel's son, used to say, "All my days I grew up among the sages, and I have found nothing better for a person than silence." That reminds me to mute everyone. So that's his first teaching. Second teaching, study is not the most important thing, but actions. Third point, whoever indulges in too many words brings about sin. So let's go in order. First of all, the name of this great sage. He's not given a title, but we'll get to that in a moment. Just a little bit about him. He was the leader of the Jewish people, the Nasi, the head of the Sanhedrin, in the period close to the destruction of the Second Temple. And tragically, he was one of the famous 10 martyrs that were murdered by the Romans because of their position as leaders of the Jewish people and the teachers of Torah. He was one of the 10 martyrs that we refer to twice a year in our prayers. On Yom Kippur, there's one section where we go through all the 10 martyrs. And then on Tisha B'Av, the day of mourning for the destruction of the temple, is also when we refer to the 10 martyrs. So Shimon was the first of the 10 martyrs to be executed. Now, from the prayer, it would seem that they all were executed at the same time. That's not really the case. It was a few decades between the first one who was executed and the last one. But he was the first of the 10 martyrs. And that marked a very troubling time for the Jewish people. In the period before the Second Temple's destruction, you had all sorts of violent groups. Some of them were pro-Roman and were anti-Jewish in many ways, anti-traditional Judaism. Many of them were anti-Roman, and they were the ones who tried to get the Jews to fight the Romans. And Shimon was involved in trying to bring some measure of peace, apparently unsuccessfully, or maybe it could have been worse if he hadn't intervened. And he was very highly respected and very highly regarded for many reasons, but particularly the fact that he was a martyr put him into a very special position in Jewish life. The Talmud says that the place where martyrs stand in the next world, nobody could get close to them. They are in a very special category, and Shimon was one of those. So here it's Shimon, his son, used to say. Now he had a title. He had the same title as his father, Rabban. So why doesn't it use his name, his title? It only uses his name, Shimon, his son. The next Mishnah that we'll be studying next week, God willing, it has another teaching from Rabbi Shimon, and there it gives us his title, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. Here it doesn't give his title, it just says his name, Shimon. So there are several explanations. One explanation is that this teaching he gave before he became the leader, when his father was still alive. So he was still not recognized as the leader, and therefore his title is not given there. And this is a common theme in the Talmud. When a sage is young, or before he reaches a position of leadership, they don't refer to him by his own title, but rather by his father's title, the son of so-and-so. Because that's very often, even today, I know people who knew my father, and when they see me, they said, "Oh, are you Mayor's son?" I don't have a name. I'm the son of my father, which is better than my name. But that's a common thing, and that was common then as well. That's a simple explanation. Another explanation is that I mentioned this last week and the week before, I believe, is that originally the title rabbi in any of its forms, Rabban, Rabbi, Rav, was not given to sages. They didn't have the title because they didn't need titles. They were greater than any title. The greatest title you can give someone is that they don't need a title. You can just call them by their first name and they already, oh wow, Hillel. You don't have to say Rabbi Hillel. When the author of the Mishna, who was a great-great-grandson of Rabbi Shimon, when he wrote the Mishnah, that was Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Rabbi Yehuda the Prince. When he wrote the Mishnah, he decided, you know what I'm going to do? My great-great-grandfather Shimon, I'm not going to give him a title, because he's greater than a title. Why of all his ancestors was that the only one? Because he was a martyr. And because of his martyrdom, he was regarded to be very special in a different category, in a higher category, who didn't need a title. The Talmud tells a story of two Jews who were not scholars or sages or great people in their own right, who gave their lives to protect the Jewish community. Once the emperor was attacked, and I think it was his daughter that was killed, and he accused the Jewish community of doing it, and he said if they don't produce the murderers, he's going to destroy the Jewish community. And these two Jews, Linus and Pappus, those were the two names, they volunteered themselves and confessed to the crime that they didn't commit. They were executed, and the Jewish community was saved. And the Talmud says that where they stand, no other person could get close to them, their position in the next world. And that's how Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi viewed his ancestor, Shimon, that he's beyond having to have a title. Another explanation is that this is part of his teaching when he talks about how there's nothing better than silence. He says, I grew up amongst the sages. In other words, I basked in the light of great people, but you know what? I never tried to show that I am equal to them. I never tried to prove my greatness to them, even though Shimon was as equal to his peers and to his teachers. But he never demonstrated that assertiveness, that he is equal to them. So the fact that he grew up amongst great sages, and he emphasized the importance of silence. Now, what does silence mean? There are many. Simple meaning of silence is not talking too much, which is understood to be the simple meaning of this teaching. But silence could also be understood as humility. I didn't interrupt someone. I didn't try to show off my knowledge and scholarship to anyone. I was silent. And in that spirit, he's just Shimon. I'm just Shimon. And I'm the son of Rabbi Gamliel. I'm not nothing special about me. And what does he emphasize? He emphasizes that even though I grew up amongst the sages, I still listen. I'm not all about showing off my knowledge. Silence means that I'm absorbing and learning more and more. And this ties in with the title that is given to a Torah scholar. How do we refer to a Torah scholar in Hebrew? Talmid Chacham. If you want to call someone a scholar, you'd say he's a Talmid Chacham. What does the word literally mean? A student of the wise. Sometimes they refer to people as a Chacham, but Chacham can also be a derogatory term. Oh, he's a Chacham, he's a wise guy. It's not always a compliment to say that someone is a Chacham. But the compliment is when you say someone is a Talmid Chacham, he's a student of the wise. What about the person who's the greatest scholar in the world? If he's still not a scholar, still not a student, he hasn't really reached the level that is required of a person. A person has to continuously learn and never say, I already learned enough. I think I mentioned this last week or at another class. I think it was in another class where you had this young person who was asked what kind of lecture would they like to hear, and the person said, I had enough lectures in college, I don't need any lectures. If I need something, I just consult my smartphone. That's the opposite of a Talmud Chacham. That's the antithesis of a Talmud Chacham. Talmud Chacham is, what more can I learn? But I already know more than anyone else in that field, but I still have to learn more and more. And that's what he was saying. I grew up amongst the sages. Not just, see, the Hebrew word for grew, as in English, can mean two things. It can mean I grew older, or it can mean I grew in stature. I did grow. I reached a high level of knowledge, but I still recognize the importance of silence, the importance of listening to what other people say. The simple meaning over here is the importance of silence, because speech is the most powerful weapon and asset that we have as human beings. In Hebrew, when you want to say human being, you don't say human being. There's no literal translation of human being that's not used. We say midaber, a speaker. There are four levels. There's inanimate, that's called domim, silent. A stone is silent. A vegetation is called sameach, which means vegetation. Animals are called chai. They're living things. They move around. They have a willpower. They want things. They could express their desires for things. And a human being, you would think, would be called a sichli, an intellectual being. Although some might argue and say, no, the animals are much smarter than humans. But what do we say to refer to a human being? He's a medaber, he's a speaker, a communicator. That's what makes us unique, that we have the power of expressing our feelings, or expressing our ideas and communicating them. So that's why speech is so precious, that makes the value of silence even more. When a person is economical with their speech, they say the right things and avoid saying the wrong things. That's what we mean when we say that speech is so valuable. It's like a diamond. You don't just flash your diamonds all the time. You put it away in a special case, in a special setting. You take it out for special occasions because it's precious. You know when to show it, when not to show it. And that's the power of speech. Now, he says, I found nothing better for a person than silence. It doesn't say person in the Hebrew. I'm not going to say it's inaccurate, but it leaves out a very important understanding, a nuance over here. The Hebrew word that's used here is laguf, for the body. There's nothing better for the body than silence. So some commentaries explain what this means is that in certain areas of life, you don't want people to be silent. When it comes to studying Torah, you don't want people to be silent. You want them to speak, to teach, to speak. And even if you're learning by yourself, you shouldn't be reading with your eyes only. You should be saying the words. The Talmud tells a story of how one student was studying, just reading the words, and the famous woman, sage, Bruria, Rabbi Meir's wife, criticized him. He says, if you want to remember what you're learning, your whole body has to be involved in what you're learning. You certainly have to utter the words. I told this story many times. I grew up in a schizophrenic environment, because when I went to the Jewish studies, in the morning we had Jewish studies, in the afternoon was secular studies. In the morning, in the Jewish studies, when we were reading the Chumash, the Bible, or the Talmud, and we weren't moving our lips, our teacher would say, why are you just reading with your eyes? Move your lips, say the words. In the afternoon, we came to the secular studies, and we asked to read things, and people moved their lips. Don't move your lips, you're just supposed to read with your eyes. So I grew up, with conflicted. The truth is, scientists, the psychologists discovered that you will remember things, retain them, and understand them much better when you actually move your lips and say the words, not just with your eyes, but the more you involve different parts of your body, especially speech, the more indelible, the more permanent the teachings become established in the person. If you just read with your eyes, it's probably not going to last as long. So you do have to use your speech and talk a lot of Torah. Don't limit yourself. The same thing with prayer. No one is telling people they shouldn't pray long because they have to be silent. The silence is only good for the body. When it comes to physical things, when it comes to other aspects of life other than the spiritual, silence is very healthy. Maimonides divides up speech into 5 categories in his commentary on the Mishna. In order, he says there's forbidden speech. Speech that is absolutely forbidden. What kind of speech is forbidden? Slandering people, lashon hara, the evil tongue. That's forbidden speech. Cursing is forbidden speech. Then there's speech that he calls where is it?
Let's discuss our business. Taking God's name in vain.
Taking God's name in vain would be forbidden speech, right? Then there's idle talk. Talk that isn't outright forbidden, but you're talking nonsense. It has no value, no intellectual, no spiritual value. Just this idle talk. Everyone knows what that can mean. Talking about the bills. What I just said was blasphemy. That was for
blasphemy. What the rest did. That's blasphemy.
Pretty much.
Then there's permissible talk.
Oh, okay.
Permissible talk.
Okay.
What's permissible talk? You're talking about, I'm going shopping today. What do you think I should buy? There's nothing positive about that. There's nothing negative about that. It's permissible. But don't get carried away with that. Don't spend your life talking about what you're going to buy at Tops.
Well, wait a minute. Tops never stops.
Then there's
Necessary. That's idle talk.
Then there's desirable talk. When you're talking about trying to help inspire people, you're trying to get them to do things. So it's desirable because you are engaging in a positive thing. That's desirable. Then there's a higher level, the obligatory talk. We're obligated to pray. We're obligated to study Torah. It's not just a nice thing to do, a desirable thing. It's an obligatory thing. Where do we have to be more careful in being silent? When it comes, obviously, to the forbidden talk, when it comes to the idle talk, and even the permissible talk, the less we talk, the better it is.
Yeah, probably. Very true. So
now, there's a story, the Baal Shem Tov is quoted as saying that if you're silent for 40 days, the divine spirit will rest upon you. You'll become like a prophet. So they tell a story of some guy who heard that, and 40 days he didn't speak, and nothing happened. So he came to his Rebbe, and he said to the Rebbe, For 40 days I was silent and nothing changed in me. So the Rebbe says, let me take you to the stable. He pointed to the horse. He said, this horse did not speak in even more than 40 days, but he remains a horse. It's not enough just to be silent, obviously. You have to, in those 40 days that you're silent, you have to fill those days with more meaning and more substance. But the idea is that if you can be silent, the more silent you could be and not say the things that you shouldn't be saying, the idle things, the forbidden things, then you become more spiritually inspired. One commentator says that this is referring to a different kind of silence. This is a difficult one. This is a major test that we often have. Someone insults you, or even worse, curses you, and really irritates you. To be silent and not respond is one of the greatest achievements, human achievements. And it gives you tremendous power. The ability to be embarrassed by someone, humiliated, attacked verbally, and you don't respond to it, you are a saintly person. That is what he's referring to over here. That the best thing is when you're insulted, when you're put down, is to be silent.
Does that refer both publicly and privately?
Whichever way, yeah. It's harder when it's public, obviously.
Because then people could think that you don't respond, it must be true what the other person said.
Okay, in a case like that, you could defend yourself, but you don't attack the person back. You don't engage in this attacking.
It is okay to respond.
It depends how you respond.
How you respond.
If the person accuses you, said that you did this terrible thing and it's not true, of course you could deny it and say it's not true, but you don't engage in a counterattack with that person,
No.
which is the most tempting thing to do.
No.
It's the most difficult thing to restrain from. And where do we find examples of people who were silent? King David was what? That was different. That was not. He wasn't humiliated.
He was silent.
He was silent because of grief.
It wasn't humiliation, no?
It was worse. I mean, his two sons were killed.
But it was also...
Okay. That's a valid thing. But we find King David was cursed by a very prestigious member of. He was the head of the Sanhedrin, Shimi ben Gera. And King David, instead of responding, he said, I deserved it. God told him to curse me. This was all preordained. I shouldn't take it seriously. And he didn't do anything to harm him, even though what he did was a capital crime. To curse the king is a capital crime in Judaism.
A Jewish king.
Yes, not a president. Not to say that you should curse a president, but it's not the same. Where else do we find someone was silent? His Benjamin was silent when he knew that his brothers sold Joseph. He could have told his father, his dad, you know what happened? Your sons sold Joseph. And he realized how devastating that would be to his father. That would be much worse than knowing that Joseph was dead, and to know that his own brothers sold him. And that's why in the breastplate that corresponded to the 12 tribes, the last gem, the last jewel, which corresponded to Benjamin, was called Yashpeh, which is really two words, Yesh Peh, there's a mouth. He had the ability to speak, and he was silent.
How did you know? Yes, what? I didn't know he was present.
We have the video.
No,
The sale.
but whether he was present or not, the brothers didn't hide it from him. There are a lot of sources that talk about how one way of achieving forgiveness for sins, atonement, is through fasting, self-mortification, denying yourself pleasures. The truth is, that's what he's saying over here, the best thing to achieve atonement and purification is not by fasting, torturing yourself, but by not speaking, restraining yourself when it comes to speech. There are people who would come to great rabbis and would say, I did this sin, how many fast days should I fast? And the rabbi would say, stop, don't fast by withholding food, fast with speech. In Hebrew it's called tanid dibur, a verbal fast. That's much more difficult than not eating.
Yeah.
It's much more difficult to restrain from speech when the speech is not called for.
They say that people that hold themselves and not answer back, but I mean big things, they can bless.
Yes. What she's saying is that there are many stories of people whose blessings would come true, and they got that gift because they restrained themselves and didn't respond when they were attacked and they were insulted and humiliated. That gives people power. I heard stories of people who didn't have children for many years, people who couldn't find a match, couldn't get married, people who were going through difficult times, and they had an opportunity where they could have responded and they didn't, and soon after that they were blessed with whatever they were missing. Yes?
What are some acceptable responses? Because say somebody says something really nasty, and it naturally generates some energy or generates something. So what are some acceptable responses that would turn it into a positive?
The best response is not to say anything. That's the best response. And especially if the person is heated up, there's another Mishna later on that says, don't try to pacify a person while they're still seething with anger, because you're just going to get them more angry. The more you engage someone who's in a fit of rage, the more angry they'll become, and the worse.
The question is more like what kind of other actions that you could take that would maybe help deflect it, or that could make the situation other than not saying anything.
Give a smile and say, I love you.
Or perhaps
That'll disarm them.
Yeah, because I know there's a prayer that kind of refers to that, and it says, make my heart or my soul eagerly pursue your commandments. So it implies that there's actions to take afterwards. Or at least it seems to be.
In other words, the main point is not to respond, especially not to respond in kind. Maybe you could say something positive to deflect things. That would be okay. But the main point is don't engage in a debate. You're not going to win the debate, first of all. And second of all, you didn't show restraint. And this restraint is really the power that empowers you and elevates you. It's not easy, and we all fail in these things. If you've got, but when you pass this test, it's an incredible power. Okay, the next thing. Study is not the most important thing, but actions. The word is not study. The word midrash means more like speaking, an exposition, a speech. Giving speeches, even though there's good speeches, is not the main thing. The main thing is the action.
Action speaks louder than words.
That's true. It's very true. In other words, silence is the greatest thing, true. But you have to, when it comes to matters of Torah, you have to speak. You can't be silent when it comes to Torah.
Oh.
But you should know that speaking is not the most important thing. It's what comes out of the speech. If your speech translates into action, then it's a valid speech. If the speech is just empty words, then that's not the most important thing.
But isn't the study of Torah equal to every other mitzvah?
If it leads to action. If a person studies Torah, let's say you're in the middle of studying Torah and someone runs into the room and says, my car, I got a flat tire and I have to go to the hospital, or I have an emergency and I need the car. Could someone come out here and help me repair that flat tire? If there's no one else out there who can do it, and you can't call the AAA or whatever, and we say, you know what? We're studying Torah right now. We can't help you. That's one of the meanings over here. What that means is that you're studying Torah, and what does Torah talk about? How you can help people. But I'm too busy studying Torah about helping people that I can't help you. So that means that your study itself is flawed. Yes, the study of Torah is the greatest mitzvah, but if the study doesn't translate into action, then the study is faulty. Yes?
In today's world, the car having a problem like a flat tire is like if your enemy's horse has fallen down and the cart is down and you have to help the enemy whether you like it or not.
Right. But I'm talking about a case where you're studying Torah. So Torah is the most important mitzvah. There's no question about that. Torah study is equal to all the mitzvahs. And yet, if you're studying Torah and you don't do what the Torah tells you to do, then that study is flawed. Yeah. You see, it's unlike any other area of knowledge. Let's say you're studying medicine and you're studying how bad it is to smoke. And you're the expert in the field. And while you're studying and doing research, you're smoking. I wouldn't respect that person maybe, but it doesn't mean that his knowledge of medicine is flawed. It's not flawed. He's the greatest authority. I remember I used to go to Roswell, and we would see nurses, this is before they banned smoking, would be standing and smoking. Now, they're working at Roswell. They should know better than anyone else that smoking is not good for you. But their knowledge didn't translate into action. So if it's secular knowledge, the knowledge stands on its own 2 feet.
Still valid.
But when it comes to Torah, if the Torah doesn't lead to action, then that Torah is flawed. There's something missing in your study. Another interpretation, yes?
What's happened with Israel for the last years. And I know my relatives, they very, very religious, 3 sons in military.
Mm-hmm. You're asking why is it in Israel some people study Torah and they don't go to the army? And the answer to that is that when someone else could do it, the people who study Torah are exempted from military service. That was always part of Judaism. That if there's no one else who can do it, why don't they draft every man, woman, and child into the army? The answer is they don't need every man, woman, and child in the army. It would probably not be good because you're disrupting the economy and it would become unwieldy. But
they don't help the economy either.
They help. Torah study is what helps everyone.
But Torah say you have to defend yourself.
No, that's why you have an army. Not everyone is in the army. Are you in the army? Am I in the army? Is anyone here in the army right now? No. But we have to defend ourselves because the army has a certain quota, how many people they need. The only question could be asked, why these and not those? And the answer is because they're engaged in something meaningful. Now, I'm not going to go into the whole debate whether everyone who studies Torah should be studying Torah their whole life and not do anything else. That's a different argument, and we'll talk about this some other. We talked about it many times. But the idea is that
even for all Shevet Levi not work.
Right, in every civilized Western country, like in America, if you're a rabbinical student, you were exempted from the army. When I grew up during the Vietnam era, I didn't have to go to the army. I was exempted. Why? Because I was a rabbinical student. During World War II, rabbinical students were exempted from the army. because they recognize that there's a need to have religious, spiritual leaders in the country, because a country can fall apart if it doesn't have any guidance and inspiration. So even the United States has that to this day. If there be a draft rabbinical student, the same thing with other religions. It's not just for rabbis, it's for any spiritual leader in any religion is exempted from the army.
Was the Lubavitcher Yeshiva exempt from supplying chaplains?
It could be, I don't know. It could be.
There was an order.
It could be that if they needed chaplains, it could be they would have drafted me. Yeah, that could be. But I never heard that there was a shortage of chaplains and they were looking for drafting.
There were only volunteers, but then actually World War II, the beginning they were exempt from the draft, but then they...
I know my father was exempted from the draft in World War II.
But the yeshivas, including the ones who were yeshivas, were told that provides a certain number.
That could be. I'm not aware of whether that happened.
His father was exempt. That made sense. I think
Obviously, if there's no one else, then everyone says in the Talmud that if in the time when there's no one else, even a bride has to go from her wedding ceremony to the battlefield. But that's where there's no one else to do it. It's a matter of self-defense. But when you have an army and the army has a certain number of soldiers they need, then there are exemptions, obviously. But anyhow, getting back to the words here, that the main thing is not the speech, but it's the action. Another understanding of this is there are people who talk a lot about what's right and what's wrong. They give good sermons, but they don't act the same way that they teach. They don't practice what they preach. So that's not acceptable. Because speaking about something and not practicing it yourself defeats the whole purpose of your speech, because people will see what you do and not what you say. And when people say, do as I say, not as I practice myself, that's hypocrisy, and people will not respect that. Then he says, whoever indulges in too many words brings about sin. Now, what does that mean, in too many words? Obviously, we're not talking about someone who's studying Torah. It could be too many words. We're not talking about someone who prays. There to be too many words. So what does that mean, too many words? So one explanation is, sometimes you could do something that you think is positive, but it could lead to something negative. And what's an example? You're not allowed to speak Lashon Hara. You can't slander other people. What about if I know someone has an enemy, and I'm standing with the enemy, and I start praising the person that this person is an enemy of? I'm praising someone, and by doing that, they said, "Wow, are you crazy? You're saying this guy is a nice guy? This guy is a rotten person." What you did is you actually, by praising the person, you actually caused the person to be insulted, to be slandered. So you have to be careful sometimes not to talk about people even in a positive way when it could lead to something negative. And how do you know? You have to use your common sense. Yes.
One thing that I learned years ago was that when I wanted to give somebody a direct compliment, to do it privately, because there were times that I said it in front of somebody else and they became jealous.
Okay, that's a good example.
And
you have to know your audience. And if you say something nice, but it will lead to people saying something negative or people getting jealous, or it's not going to be received the right way. So you're saying too much with good intentions, but it could lead to hate. It could lead to something negative. Another example the commentaries give is from the first sin that ever committed. What was the first sin? Eating of the forbidden fruit. Adam and Eve partook of the tree of knowledge. How did that happen? God told them not to. How could they not resist what was the gimmick the serpent used to get them to violate this? So the Midrash tells us this is what happened. And there are two versions of this. I'll take the version that makes Adam look bad, not Eve. When Adam tells Eve, you know, I got a commandment from God saying we shouldn't eat this from this tree of knowledge. It's off limits to us. We can eat everything else except this one tree is off limits to you. Adam didn't trust his wife that she would abide by that. So Adam added on something. He says, I'm not allowed to even touch it, because as soon as we'll touch the tree, we will die. Well, the serpent starts engaging Eve into a discussion, and the Eve says, we're not allowed to touch this tree even, or else we'll die. And the serpent pushed her against the tree, and nothing happened. She didn't get electrocuted. Nothing happened. So the serpent says, you see, it's a fairy tale. There's no such thing. It's harmless. If just like nothing will happen by touching it, nothing will happen by eating it. And she ate the fruit of the tree, and the rest is history. To this day, we're still suffering from that sin. So what does that tell you? That by adding on something, even though Adam meant well, he meant to say, I'm going to make sure she doesn't eat, she might get close to the tree and she might be tempted. I'll tell her you shouldn't even touch the tree. But because of that adding on, she succumbed to the temptation and brought death to the world. So that's the first example of how you can sometimes add things thinking that you're enhancing whatever it is. What Adam could have done is told Eve, you know what, God told us not to eat this fruit. I'm suggesting that we don't even get near it. If he would have said that, that would have been okay. That's the explanation for all the rabbinical commandments. The Torah says you're not allowed to add on to the commandments of the Torah. What are all the rabbinical commandments? Purim is a rabbinical commandment. How do they add on another? So one of the explanations is, we're not saying that it's biblical, that it's the same status as biblical. We're saying that in addition to the biblical commandments we have to keep, God wants us to add on more observances corresponding to the needs of that time. So we're not adding on by saying, if someone says, it says in the Torah that we have to read the Megillah on Purim, it doesn't say that in the Torah. It's in the book of Esther, which is part of the biblical corpus, but it's not the same as anything in the 5 books of Moses. So Maimonides explains that the rabbis don't tell you that this is the biblical commandment. They're telling you this is a rabbinical commandment added on, so everyone knows that they're not going to equate this with the biblical commandments. And there were practical differences between the two. Yes?
But God did tell us that we should obey our designated leaders.
Yes.
And that's where the rabbis are getting
That's
their...
right. But as long as we know that these come from the leaders and not coming directly from the Torah. That's how Maimonides reconciles the idea of not adding on with the fact that we have added on. Now, let me just conclude with going back to the name Shimon. I mentioned before that he was a martyr, the first of the 10 martyrs. What was the reason for the 10 martyrs? Why did they die? So our sages tell us that they were a reincarnation of the 10 brothers of Joseph who sold him. And their souls needed purification, and that's how they received purification, by becoming martyrs. They were the 10 sons of Jacob, the 10 brothers of Joseph. Who was the one who started the whole thing against Joseph to kill him? Which brother?
One of the older ones.
Right. You know, does anyone know which one? No, it wasn't Reuben. Reuben tried to save him. No, Yehuda said to sell him, not to kill him.
It's one of the older ones.
Shimon said to Levi. Shimon was the instigator of it. So it was Shimon's speech that caused all the problems that led to the exile in Egypt.
So here's a Shimon.
So here, I haven't found anyone saying this, that this Shimon was the reincarnation of that Shimon, but it's very possible that he was the incarnation of Shimon because of his words that were unauthorized, that were improper words, although they meant it for good reasons. Why do they want to kill Joseph? It wasn't just petty jealousy. They felt that Joseph was a false prophet. Joseph was telling them about his dreams, that he's going to become the king, everyone's going to bow down to him. Joseph was a prophet, and he was saying it as a prophecy. And Joseph thought by telling them the prophecy, they're going to say, well, we better respect you because you're a prophet. Instead, it just backfired, and it caused them to hate him even more. So it was speech, excessive speech. Joseph spoke too much, the brothers spoke too much, and Shimon, more than any of the other brothers, said too much. He's the one who said, let's get rid of him. So this other Shimon had to atone for that, and that's why he emphasizes the importance of watching what you say, and that silence can sometimes lead to sin.
Wait, just a second, Rabbi. But it was Joseph who said to the brothers years later, this was the Yad Hashem.
Right.
You understand? So you can look at it from the other side.
But still, if I punch someone in the nose, it was God's will, but I still get held accountable for doing a punishment because I chose to be the instrument. That's free choice. That's why Pharaoh was punished, even though God promised that the Jews would be slaves. So why punish Pharaoh? Because God didn't say Pharaoh was going to do it. He chose to do it. King David, as I mentioned before, said when Shimei cursed him, he says, God told him to curse me, but yet Shimei was considered to be guilty of the crime of cursing. And later on, he was executed by King Solomon. So that's not an excuse just because it was preordained by God that you're going to do it, and therefore you're fully accountable. So the Shimon was fully accountable for selling Joseph, Shimon and his other brothers, but he was the ringleader. Another thing that I read is that Shimon, the author of this Mishna, lived at a time when Christianity was beginning to promote their messianic view and preaching. And one of the things that Christianity preached was that the mitzvahs are no longer necessary. God does not need us to fulfill all the commandments. You just have to believe and preach the gospel, so to speak. And that's what Shimon was saying. Too much talk and not action, being theologically spiritual, but practically you don't have to do anything as long as you embrace their faith. He says no, it's not the talking about God, it's the translating the talk into action. Because one of the main objectives of Christianity is to deny that the Torah, which they call the Old Testament, is no longer valid. We no longer have to keep all the mitzvahs. We don't have to keep Shabbos. We don't have to keep kosher. We don't have to keep all the commandments because he fulfilled them for us. So Shimon was telling us, no, it's the action that counts. Judaism is a religion of action. Without the action, all the speech and all the lofty ideals are meaningless.
They like to ignore Matthew chapter 23, where Jesus says you have to obey every single...
Well, they come up with explanations for that. Yes.
Your teacher and your job.
And I'm saying too much? Is that what you're saying?
Not about you. Not about you. Because when you speak and we come to you on your classes, because it's interesting.
Don't say too much.
Not interesting, we don't come. Now, but in my experience, I see many orators, speakers, sorry. They speak to show how they are educated. Many words and long many words, and maybe my poor English, but if I understand not many ideas. But it show how they much know, how they are educated, and
Okay, Maimonides says something else, and apparently he interprets this differently from the other commentators. But even when you teach Torah, Maimonides says, and it's based on the Talmud, you should always be concise, succinct. In other words, don't be too verbal. Don't just keep on going on and on and on, embellishing it, right? Because that it's going to confuse the students. Always get to the point. Of course, if a student doesn't understand, you explain things, but a person should always be concise, brief. That's why even when you're teaching Torah. But everything is relative. It says brief relative to. That's a sign for us to end. That's a good signal.
There you go.
I once heard people talking about different rabbis, and one person was saying about his rabbi is so smart that he could sit for hours and you don't hear a word from him. He's so careful not to say something that could be misunderstood, misinterpreted, and the other person says, my rabbi is greater. He speaks for hours and never says something foolish. It's very easy to be smart when you're silent, but to be silent even when you're speaking, you're silent from the things that are capable of causing people to misunderstand you. But that's why it's important for students to always ask questions, because sometimes the teacher says things that could be misunderstood. So that if the student doesn't challenge the teacher doesn't know that he just said something that was distorted and misunderstood and could cause harm. So it's always important to question the speaker. Any questions?
Silence.
Announce the Megillah reading.
Okay, tomorrow night is Purim. We'll be reading the Megillah here at 7:45. And Friday morning at 8:30 a.m.
So, Rabbi, we won't have class on Friday, right?
Friday we'll have a very short class at 12 o'clock. A 5-10 minute class. Okay, also it's on Purim. On Purim, there's a mitzvah to exchange food gifts, two types of food with at least one person, and to give gifts to the poor, to at least two poor people. If you don't know anyone poor, I take the money and I go to Las Vegas, and I... Only kidding, I should have been silent. Yeah. I get it to some poor people, hopefully with maybe some on Purim, but if not on Purim itself, I give it after Purim. And Maimonides writes, the most important mitzvah on Purim is to give to the poor. That's the most important.